Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take the source material you need, the essential books, the seminal speeches, the key research, and distill it into instant, actionable knowledge. Today we are undertaking a deep dive into the life of a colossal figure of the 20th century, a man whose existence was less a steady trajectory and more a series of intellectual explosions, Malcolm X.
We're tracing the monumental and frankly just astonishing transformation of Malcolm X, a man who was born into poverty and violence, climbed the ladder of the big city underworld, then became the radical, uncompromising voice of religious black nationalism, and finally a global human rights advocate whose vision really transcended the borders of the United States.
His journey, it just encapsulates the deepest, most systemic struggles against racism and oppression faced by Americans in that century. To understand this incredible self-made man and the fuel that powered his evolution, we're relying on two primary, very potent sources. The raw, unflinching narrative in his own autobiography, which gives us that emotional and psychological architecture, and then the fiercely strategic political doctrine in his landmark 1964 speech, The Ballot or the Bullet.
And our mission today is to follow that dramatic arc. We're going to start with the trauma that radicalized his family, move through his self-creation in the streets and in prison, and then focus specifically on the complex defining elements of his Nation of Islam ideology. And we'll conclude with the profound intellectual and philosophical break that shifted his fight from a domestic, civil rights issue to a global human rights imperative. This is really the story of how anger was weaponized and then refined.
Okay, so let's jump right into the deepest foundation of his consciousness, which, well, it really begins with his father, Earl Little. The autobiography paints a truly compelling, almost mythical picture of this man.
He was a physical force, 6'4", known for being very black, powerful, and, tragically, having only one eye. But more importantly, he was an unflinching, spiritual adherent of Marcus Garvey's philosophy. And this wasn't just some passing interest, it was the framework for their entire family life.
Right, that Garvey influence is the wellspring of Malcolm's later militancy. It established black nationalism right there in the home long before the Nation of Islam ever entered his life. Can you expand on what Garveyism meant in that context?
Well, Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, it was a philosophy of uncompromising Negro self-respect, self-reliance, and critically, the Back to Africa movement. It provided this powerful, pre-baked alternative to the demoralizing idea of seeking, integration or assimilation to white American culture. It insisted that black people had a proud history and a destiny separate from the American project.
And his father's commitment to this wasn't just some philosophical window dressing. It was born from unimaginable specific trauma.
Exactly. His radicalism, his absolute dedication to self-defense and black identity, it was rooted in the most brutal reality of American racism. The sources revealed that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die violently, including one by lynching, all at the hands of white men in the South. This wasn't theoretical injustice, this was a personal blood debt. And he carried that loss north with him.
That is the specific, brutal, and generational origin of the family's militancy. What were those UNIA gatherings actually like?
They were intense, highly disciplined private meetings, held in homes, never in public halls, because of the constant threat of violence. They were small, never more than 20 or so dedicated followers, but they created this cocoon of identity and purpose. And young Malcolm was brought right into this atmosphere of intense political and spiritual fervor.
You can just visualize the scene. People gathered in secret, fueling each other with these revolutionary ideas. What exactly were the concepts they were internalizing?
They preached Africa for the Africans, the idea that the homeland must be reclaimed and governed by black people. And they closed every single meeting with this incredibly powerful, motivating chant. Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will. This wasn't passive prayer, it was an ideological command, and Malcolm absorbed it from his earliest years.
That chant must have been the ultimate psychological defense mechanism against the constant societal messaging that they were inferior.
Precisely. That philosophy drilled into him in childhood. It became the psychological underpinning for his later uncompromising rhetoric, regardless of whether he was speaking for Garveyism, the Nation of Islam, or the OAAU. He was raised with the concept that black people were the original man, inherently superior and capable of ultimate self-determination.
But that foundation was just violently ripped out from under him with the death of his father.
Yes. The mother, Louise Little, reportedly had this strong, unsettling intuition about his impending fate. The event itself was horrifying. He was attacked, his skull crushed, and then, in a calculated act of violence, laid across streetcar tracks where he was run over, nearly cutting his body in half. The autobiography attributes his survival for 2.5 hours in that condition to the inherent physical and mental resilience of what he termed Georgia Negroes, who had been hardened by generations of struggles simply to survive such a brutal environment.
That detail about the Georgia Negroes, it really speaks to the source material recognizing a deep, almost mystical strength that's born of endurance in the face of just relentless systemic trauma.
It connects his father's violent end not to weakness, but to a primal strength needed to resist destruction. But the trauma was immediately compounded by a systemic betrayal, the insurance claim.
Yes, the financial injustice that followed was such a cruel lesson in how the system works.
Earl Little had 2 insurance policies. A small one paid out quickly. But the larger policy company refused payment, claiming it was a suicide. And the source material confirms this refusal, legally sanctioned by the white system, solidified the family's deep-seated bitterness and distrust of white people and the institutions they controlled. It wasn't just the loss of a parent. It was a visible financial act of white violence against the family unit.
And once the father was gone, the family's economic and psychological decline was swift, which led to the intervention of the welfare system. And this is where the story truly turns dark, because the welfare system, instead of helping, seemed to have been designed to dismantle them psychologically.
It was psychological warfare masquerading as aid. The sources describe the welfare workers coming to the house, asking 1,000 intrusive questions, viewing the family not as human beings in distress, but as just things. They were objects of pity and scrutiny, not people to be respected.
And the description goes further. It details active measures to undermine the mother's authority and her sanity.
Absolutely. The welfare system specifically targeted the proud, educated mother. The workers, seeing her resistance to their control, suggested she was losing her mind. The autobiography notes deliberate attempts to plant seeds of division among the children, asking questions like who was smarter or who misbehaved, in order to pit them against each other and solidify their own authority.
That is just a chilling analysis of systemic control destroying the internal fabric of the family to manage the survivors.
This came to a head over a seemingly minor but deeply symbolic act of resistance: food. The family had adopted Seventh-day Adventist beliefs, which restricted diet. When the mother refused butchered pork provided by the system, it was immediately used as proof of her instability.
So she was fighting to maintain cultural, spiritual, and moral integrity, and that resistance was judged as instability by the very system responsible for their collapse.
It's the ultimate illustration of how the system demands total submission, even down to dictating what they eat. So when young Malcolm was finally removed and sent to a detention home, the mother's single heartbreaking instruction, her last act of parental control, was, don't let them feed him any pig.
That instruction, don't let them feed him any pig. I mean, it's not just about food, is it? It's about fighting for cultural and religious integrity. A final, desperate refusal to let the white system completely strip him of his identity, even as she was losing her own battle.
It frames the refusal of pork, which becomes a key NOI doctrine later, not as some new religious rule, but as a deep-seated legacy of resistance passed down from his mother, reinforcing the pride and the uncompromising nature of his early life.
That systemic trauma drove young Malcolm, and it drove him to seek an identity, which first led him down the difficult and ultimately futile road of attempted assimilation in Mason, Michigan, while he was living with the white Swirlin family. He was popular, bright, a novelty.
He had the seal of approval of a very important woman in town, Mrs. Swirlin. He was class president, had top grades, and in his own words, he was desperately trying to be white, to fit in, to achieve the American dream through sheer intelligence and hard work. He was, to them, like a pink poodle, a charming, exceptional anomaly.
He believed that academic success could transcend the racial barriers he'd seen destroy his family. But the moment that belief was annihilated is perhaps the single most crushing moment in the entire autobiography, and it comes from his English teacher, Mr. Ostrowski.
This moment is absolutely pivotal. Malcolm was dreaming of becoming a lawyer. He was articulate, he had the grades, he had the popular support, and yet Mr. Ostrowski, a seemingly well-meaning authority figure, advised him, the class president, to pursue carpentry instead. And the reason was explicit and just devastating: because you are a Negro.
Wow. The internal fallout was instantaneous and irreversible. The source material makes it so clear that he realized he was not intelligent enough in their eyes to become whatever I wanted to be. That single sentence destroyed the illusion of integration and initiated a profound internal withdrawal from the white world.
It showed him that his merit, his grades, his popularity, it all meant nothing against the crushing weight of racial categorization. He had been tricked into believing the system rewarded hard work. After that, his strategy changed from assimilation to rejection, and he sought identity in the urban environment, far from Mason.
And one of the clearest physical manifestations of that shame and self-rejection was the conch.
The conch was more than just a hairstyle. It was a physical, chemical act of self-flagellation, an attempt to chemically approximate whiteness. The description of the procedure is agonizingly detailed and reveals the depth of his self-hatred at that time.
Tell us about the preparation and the agony involved.
It was a destructive process, using a homemade lye conch. His friend Shorty would mix lye, the corrosive chemical, into thin sliced potatoes and then pour in the mixture. They couldn't use a metal spoon because the lye would turn it black, which just highlights the dangerous corrosive power of the solution they were applying directly to his scalp.
And the resulting sensation.
The autobiography describes his head beginning to catch fire. He had to clench his teeth, his eyes watered profusely, and his nose ran uncontrollably as the lye burned his skin. It took painful, repeated applications of soap and rinsing with cold water to finally neutralize the lye and stop the stinging.
It sounds barbaric, yet he pursued it because the outcome was seen as desirable, a transformation that, in his words, was staggering.
It was staggering because it created the illusion of success within the urban black hierarchy. But the adult Malcolm X, the minister, he looked back and saw the conch, and similarly the white wigs worn by black women, as a literal, painful emblem of his shame that he is black. It represented a complete and catastrophic loss of true identity, replaced by a cheap, chemical mimicry of the oppressor.
That profound shame drove him deeper into the Harlem underworld, where he learned the hustle, first as a railroad hustler in the North.
The railroad environment was a masterclass in performing for white approval. He learned the survival trick of giving white people a show to maximize tips, which included theatrical gestures like popping the shoeshine rag.
And the dining car staff, they all understood this transaction, didn't they? It was a kind of professionalized subservience.
It was cynical transactional theater. Waiters and porters openly faked their Uncle Tomming, specifically to extract liberal tips from white clientele who were obsessed with their own importance and wanted the impression of being lavishly catered to by happy, subservient Negroes. Malcolm learned that these white people weren't paying for service, they were paying for a performance that affirmed their own superiority.
And this cynical environment taught him the foundational rule of the hustler's code. Never trust anyone outside the closed-mouthed circle.
He quickly internalized the hierarchy of the streets. He learned from the fronts, the low-level operatives, up to the revered old heads like West Indian Archie and Black Sammy, who had worked for Dutch Schultz in the notorious numbers game, a racket they openly referred to by the derogatory term nigger pool. This was his real education in societal power structures and the racial economy of crime.
This life of crime, which involved various levels of hustling and burglary, eventually culminated in his capture and a sentence that seems wildly disproportionate. 8 to 10 years for a first offense burglary.
That sentence length was the key indication that the court was punishing more than just the property crime. He reflected that the length was largely attributed to the fact that his gang had taken the white man's women, well-to-do upper-middle-class whites. The authorities were fundamentally disturbed by the violation of racial sexual taboos of the time, viewing it as a deeper transgression against the social order than the actual theft.
So the true crime, in the eyes of the court, was daring to violate the racial caste system. But prison, intended as punishment, became the place of his massive internal self-creation.
Indeed. It began with a seemingly simple instruction from his half-brother, Reginald, who was a new adherent of the Nation of Islam. Reginald wrote, instructing him to quit pork and cigarettes.
And the promptness of his response is striking.
He quit smoking immediately, finished the pack he had opened, and just crushed the rest. When pork was served days later, the instruction, "Don't eat any more of that dirty white man's pig," flashed on a screen before me, a visual echo of his mother's dying instruction.
But he initially complied not out of deep faith, but out of a calculation. He sensed a major opportunity, a potential psychological hype that could help him manipulate the system and get out of prison.
That's a fascinating insight into his calculating hustler mind merging with his conversion. But that compliance, driven initially by self-interest, led directly to his spiritual awakening. The sources reveal the profoundly personal and difficult nature of his religious commitment.
He had lived a life of physical toughness, but he described the hardest test he ever faced in his life as simply praying to Allah.
He struggled with waves of shame and embarrassment, noting that picking a lock was literally the only reason his knees had ever been bent before. He had to physically force himself into the posture of submission. This struggle highlights the depth of his break from his previous predatory self. It's a literal physical turning away from the hustler's code.
And this spiritual commitment immediately exposed his intellectual deficiencies. He realized he was not functionally literate enough to articulate his new beliefs, especially in letters to Elijah Muhammad.
He realized he was only the most articulate hustler on the street, not a genuinely educated man. This realization was the catalyst for his rigorous, self-driven educational project, focusing first on penmanship and vocabulary.
The sheer dedication is legendary. I mean, he copied the entire dictionary page by page.
He copied every word, every definition, every comma. This served two purposes.
Clear.
It taught him vast vocabulary and improved his handwriting so he could correspond clearly with the messenger. It wasn't just rote learning. It was like studying a miniature, comprehensive encyclopedia of Western thought. He would read up to 15 hours a day, devouring everything from Western philosophy, Schopenhauer, Kant, Nietzsche to literature like Milton's Paradise Lost.
That is the intensity of a man with nothing else to do but remake himself. He later made a controversial but compelling claim about this self-education.
Yes, he mused that his intense study, free from the distractions of the outside world, from the pandy-raiding fraternities and bula-bula of college life, made his homemade education superior to that received by college graduates. He felt prison provided the unique motivation and total isolation necessary, not just to acquire knowledge, but to teach him how to think critically and synthesize information objectively.
And this intense reading, it actually validated the Nation of Islam's teachings for him.
Critically so. Reading books validated the NOI teaching that history had been deliberately whitened. Discovering truths about Nat Turner's slave revolt, the history of African civilizations, or the systematic erasure of black achievements gave him intellectual ammunition. He realized the white man's system was built on a deliberate fraud, a neurotic necessity to hide the black man's true role in history. This transformed him from a street hustler into a terrifyingly logical debater and orator.
This intellectual furnace created the minister, and when he emerged, he was the primary spokesman for the Nation of Islam, delivering a fiercely uncompromising message rooted in a very specific and psychologically potent theology.
The theology of the NOI was the foundation of the movement's psychological power.
Yeah.
Elijah Muhammad taught that Master W.D. Fard was the Messiah and Muhammad was his messenger. But the central, radical element was the origin story of the white race.
Which was?
That the white race was the devil race, purposefully bred by a rogue black scientist named Mr. Jacob 6,000 years ago, specifically to create hell on earth and dominate the original man-black people.
Wow, that sounds like a radical inversion of all existing Christian and racial hierarchy in America. What was the psychological function of that myth for the membership?
It was monumental. It took the entire weight of oppression, violence, and dehumanization that black people had experienced in America and placed the moral, historical, and spiritual blame squarely on the oppressor, removing the burden of shame and failure from the oppressed. By making black people the original man, God's favored children who were kidnapped from their homeland, it restored absolute dignity and self-worth instantaneously.
His sermons then were focused on leveraging that restored dignity to motivate change.
Exactly. He argued that black Americans were mentally, morally, and spiritually dead because they had been stripped of their true name, culture, and history by the devil.
And he didn't just criticize the white man. He turned the concept of racial hatred back on the perpetrator with just devastating effect.
He famously argued that the white man hates the black man because he sees in him a mirror of his crime, a reflection of the atrocities committed through slavery and oppression, a deep collective historical guilt that the white man had to deny in order to survive his own narrative.
Beyond the powerful theology, the NOI was also a total social reform system that offered structure and discipline. They enforced a very strict behavioral code.
It was a complete overhaul of lifestyle. Absolutely no gambling, no narcotics, no alcohol, no dancing, no tobacco, and echoing his mother's final instruction, no pork. This rigid code was incredibly appealing to people seeking dignity and stability in chaotic urban environments.
And this structure proved particularly effective in tackling the most entrenched social problems of the ghetto, especially drug addiction.
The NOI used a grueling, radical, non-medical withdrawal process. Once an addict accepted he was hooked, Muslims would attend to them 24/7. And the psychological cure was paramount. Addicts were told to literally kick whitey off your back. equating the addiction to the oppression that created the environment for the addiction.
Wait, can you elaborate on that psychological connection? Why was that phrase, kick whitey off your back, so potent?
Because it reframed the failure. Instead of seeing the addiction as a personal moral failing, which only brought more shame, the NOI framed it as a literal external force, the white man's society. They created the environment of despair and provided the poison. Therefore, kicking the habit became a revolutionary act of victory over the oppressor. They even used junkie jargon like, baby, knock that monkey off your back.
So the resulting recovery wasn't just physical, it was internalized as a political victory, making the newly clean ex-addict a powerful living example of the NOI's revitalizing force.
It was that same radical commitment to internal discipline and self-control that fueled their political doctrine, black nationalism, which we find so powerfully outlined in the ballot or the bullet.
Let's pivot to that political philosophy. How did Malcolm X define black nationalism in practical rather than theological terms?
He was absolutely clear. Political black nationalism meant that black men must fully control the politics and the politicians in their own community. He declared that the time for white people, or for a Negro puppet figure sent in by the white establishment to dictate leadership, was long gone.
And economically, this wasn't about seeking jobs within the white system. It was about building a separate, self-sustaining system.
Precisely. The message was economic self-reliance. Black people must own, operate, and control the entire economy of their communities. And he justified this with a deeply pragmatic argument, saying that the white man is too intelligent to let someone else come and gain control of the economy of his community. Therefore, black people needed to demonstrate that same intelligence by investing within and protecting their own borders.
This was a clear, separatist economic philosophy. And electorally, he argued that black people held a strategic weapon that was often ignored.
The black vote was in a strategic position. He argued that the white majority was so evenly divided politically, constantly having these razor-thin elections, that the black bloc vote could determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse.
That perspective repositions black voters from passive petitioners for civil rights to a strategic power bloc capable of exercising massive leverage.
He spoke from the perspective of the 22 million black victims of Americanism. He refused to identify as a Republican or a Democrat because, as he said, he had only ever seen hypocrisy, never democracy, emanating from those systems. His political stance was one of radical independence, aimed at holding both parties accountable.
His national public prominence just exploded after that 1959 television special, The Hate That Hate Produced.
Oh, yeah. That special created an instant avalanche of public reaction, and it made the name Black Muslims stick, despite his consistent 2-year effort to correct the term to simply Muslims. He was suddenly a national figure, and he used that attention ruthlessly.
He became the angry, direct challenger to the white press, which constantly fixated on the NOI's message of hate. How did he handle that criticism?
He countered their questions by aggressively flipping the script. He argued that Christianity was, historically, the white man's greatest single ideological weapon for enslaving non-white people globally. He would demand why they weren't asking about the hate inherent in slavery or segregation. He systematically refuted the idea of civil rights advances.
Can you give an example of his refutation of those advances?
He famously dismissed the 1954 Supreme Court decision on school integration as nothing more than trickery and magic. He argued it was designed to give Negroes a cheer while simultaneously providing whites with loopholes and 10 years to delay integration. He saw integration attempts as a stalling tactic, not a genuine shift in power.
So he used controversy and historical examples to throw reporters off balance, mastering the media game by providing the kind of inflammatory quote he knew would make the front page.
He was a master rhetorician who understood that the attention was the currency. But all this time, his unwavering devotion was to Elijah Muhammad, and that devotion was about to lead him toward a catastrophic internal crisis.
And the sources cite the specific turning point in 1963.
Yes. That was when paternity suits were filed against Elijah Muhammad by 2 former secretaries who charged he fathered their children. This revelation hit Malcolm X with staggering force. He had seen other Muslims charged with adultery, a crime punishable by isolation or expulsion, but his mind simply refused to accept this grotesque immorality in his leader, his spiritual guide.
I can only imagine the intellectual and spiritual vertigo he must have felt, having built his entire new identity around this man's perfection.
It was a betrayal of loyalty and faith that shattered his world. He later admitted that this was how he first realized he had believed in his leader more than he believed in himself. He had outsourced his moral compass. This profound crisis of faith, the forced acknowledgement that his deity was flawed, was the true beginning of his break, compelling him to finally muster the nerve and the strength to start facing the facts, to think for myself.
That crisis forced him into his final, most profound philosophical evolution, moving the struggle beyond the internal confines of America and shifting from the framework of civil rights to the far broader platform of human rights.
In The Ballot or the Bullet, he articulated this strategic move brilliantly. He publicly declared that he was not a beneficiary of America, but a victim of Americanism, viewing the U.S. not through the lens of the American dream, but through the hard, harsh reality of the American nightmare.
And the practical purpose of shifting to human rights was to internationalize the struggle.
Precisely. By moving the fight to the human rights arena, the case of the 22 million Afro-Americans could be elevated and presented before the United Nations. This allowed him to align the American struggle alongside issues like the anti-colonial struggles in Angola and the human rights abuses in other nations.
This reframing was a masterstroke of political strategy, wasn't it? It bypassed the very American legal system that was designed to protect itself.
It did. It took the focus off the U.S. government's internal, slow-moving legal mechanisms, like the Supreme Court, which he believed was rigged to uphold white supremacy, and subjected the country to global scrutiny under the UN Charter. He wanted the U.S. to be held accountable by the world, just as they held other nations accountable for issues like the Hungarian question or the plight of Jews in Russia. He wanted to shame America on the world stage.
This global perspective was irrevocably cemented by his pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. But even getting there required a massive act of grace.
It did. His half-sister, Ella Little Collins, who had actually been banned from the Nation of Islam due to their stringent rules, stepped up and financed his pilgrimage. This journey was visual and spiritually transformative for him, and the sources really stress the immediate impact of the experience.
What specifically shocked him about the Hajj?
The profound, genuine colorblindness of the global Muslim community. He saw kings and peasants, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims from various nations, all wearing the same simple Murim garb, praying shoulder to shoulder, completely stripped of any racial or class distinction. It was the antithesis of everything he had experienced in America and even within the racially exclusive structure of the NOI.
And the result was the core shift in his thinking, the monumental conclusion that rewrote his entire political philosophy.
He concluded that the white man is not inherently evil, but rather that America's deeply racist society and the system of white supremacy influences him to act evilly. This was the ideological break. His fight would henceforth be against white racists, the ideology and the system, not against all white people inherently, regardless of their religious affiliation.
That is a fundamental move away from racial theology toward a social, political, and economic analysis of power and justice.
He was seeking truth and justice regardless of race, stating, "I'm a human being first and foremost." This intellectual evolution opened the door for him to develop a much broader and sharper political strategy, including his incisive critique of American political parties.
And that critique is famously encapsulated in the analogy of the fox and the wolf.
It's a perfect analogy for his distrust of the two major parties. He described the Republican Party as the conservative wolf, openly dangerous and predatory, which at least kept him alert in fighting for survival. The Democratic Party, conversely, was the liberal fox, smooth, sly, and capable of lulling him into a false sense of security with promises and token gestures.
And he saw the fox as more dangerous because it used deceit and complacency to ensure the black man stayed trapped.
Exactly. The fox promises to open the cage, but never quite gets around to it, ensuring dependency. This distrust explains his critique of Northern white allies and freedom riders. He often lamented that they should focus on killing the rats and roaches in their own segregated northern ghettos, criticizing them for seeking the moral high ground or status symbol integration elsewhere, instead of fixing the entrenched poverty and institutional racism right at home in their own backyards.
And this cynicism was most apparent in his analysis of the 1963 March on Washington. He did not see it as a triumph.
Far from it. He described what it should have been. A militant, unorganized, leaderless expression of national bitterness, a black powder keg that would scare the American establishment into immediate action.
But once the White House intervened and the major Negro leaders were brought in, he saw it as co-opted.
It was taken over by white liberals and bourgeois Negroes. He described the transformation from a potential riptide of rage into a gentle status symbol outing. an event that he noted one English newspaper aptly called the Gentle Flood, complete with gospels and guitars, effectively neutralizing its radical potential.
So to him, it was a farce.
A complete farce designed to lull the black masses into believing they had achieved something profound, only for them to inevitably realize they had been smoothly hoaxed again, which, he predicted, would only lead to a renewed, deeper anger down the line.
In his final year after the break with the NOI, he tried to translate this refined, globally minded black nationalism into political action by establishing the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or OAAU.
The OAAU's vision remained black nationalist, focused on political and economic control, but it was structurally inclusive. Critically, it embraced all faiths of black men, moving past the rigid, race-specific theology of the NOI. Its mission was comprehensive, addressing the black man's mental, spiritual, economic, and political sicknesses through community control and strength.
This independent stance and his global travel, particularly the exposure he gained at the United Nations, brought immense danger.
He was under constant surveillance,
Yeah.
noting that at his hotel he was watched as if he were John Dillinger or somebody. The threats were relentless and systematic, primarily emanating from his former organization.
The knowledge of the impending danger fueled a chilling realism about his own fate.
The betrayal from the NOI was so deep and the death threats so pervasive that he chillingly stated that if he were still alive when his autobiography came out, it will be a miracle. That line just speaks volumes about the sacrifice he was making for intellectual honesty.
Ultimately, the enduring message of his final year, as observed by a contemporary, was his absolute refusal of caution to hypocrisy in the presence of white folks.
He refused to engage in the political dance of deference. He reminded black men that self-respect could only be regained by fighting their own battles under their own leadership. That refusal to feign subservience, the way he commanded a room and spoke the unfiltered, radical truth, was what truly terrified the establishment and captivated the masses.
He broke the expectation of compromise.
Yes, and in doing so, he cemented a legacy far broader than the one he inherited from the Nation of Islam. He transformed himself into a symbol of uncompromising self-determination.
What a monumental arc of transformation we've traced. From the trauma of his family's destruction in Lansing to the calculated crime of the Harlem underworld through the powerful, disciplined rhetoric of the Nation of Islam, and finally to the globally focused human rights mission of his final year.
The single thread that connected every stage of that journey, from the hustler to the global advocate, was his almost monastic dedication to self-improvement through intensive study. He understood that true power lay in intellectual mastery.
And let's revisit that controversial belief about his prison education. He firmly believed that the education he acquired in prison, studying up to 15 hours a day, copying the entire dictionary, was superior to that provided by formal colleges. Why did he hold that conviction so strongly?
Well, he viewed the college environment as conferring a mere status symbol, the degree, but being riddled with distractions and social pressures that diluted the learning process. Prison, for him, provided the unique and desperate motivation and the total, singular isolation necessary to acquire knowledge and, more importantly, to teach him how to think and synthesize information objectively, without the need for pre-approved curricular interpretations. His true alma mater was, in his words, books.
That focus on radical self-reliance and intellectual integrity is just staggering.
As we wrap up this deep dive, here's a provocative thought for you to carry forward. The learner.
Malcolm X noted what he considered the fatal mistake of German Jews who, between World War I and Hitler's rise, assimilated and intermarried, arguing they lost their distinct, self-sustaining Jewish ethnic and cultural roots before the ultimate crisis of the Holocaust. So, if societal unity or integration comes at the ultimate expense of a distinct, self-sustaining ethnic and cultural identity, if you sacrifice group cohesion for inclusion, does that sacrifice political and cultural resilience? How can minority groups effectively balance the competing needs for unity within the larger society and the maintenance of a strong, distinct group identity necessary for self-determination?
That tension between assimilation and separation, between power and acceptance, was the central dilemma he wrestled with until his final breath. And it remains an essential question for communities today.
Something profound to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this intense deep dive into the evolution of Malcolm X. We'll see you next time.